Hello, everybody. It's Monday, June the 2nd, 2025. A couple of weeks ago, we did a show with a New Yorker staff writer. All writers want to be New Yorker staff writers. John Cassidy. He's been at the New Yorker since 1995. He has an interesting new book out called Capitalism and Its Critics, a history from the Industrial Revolution to AI. He focuses on the abstract critiques of capitalism. And today we're going full circle. We have another New Yorker staff writer. In fact, he is, like John Cassidy, based in Brooklyn, 10 minutes away. Yeah. John Seabrook. John has a new book out. It's called The Spinach King, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. Some ways it's a very different book from Cassidy's Capitalism and Its Critics. In other ways, it's rather similar in the sense that I think it's a critique of the history, or one history, of American capitalism. John Seabrook, I was going to call you John Cassidy, John. Everyone who is a staff writer on the New Yorker is called John and lives in Brooklyn. Congratulations, John, on the new book. Would it be fair? You obviously wrote it independently from Cassidy's new book, but would it be fair to call your book The Spinach King, which is in some ways highly autobiographical? It's a story of your own family. You're a Seabrook, of course. Is it a critique of American capitalism?
Actually, I think that's a rather astute observation, Andrew. I thought that myself. It is a critique of American capitalism. It's a critique of, really, it's a story of how American capitalism sort of overrides American democracy in many ways, and people are willing to surrender individual rights that are guaranteed them by the Constitution if they think they're involved in a capitalist enterprise that's going to make them money, really. And so what you have really in The Spinach King is kind of a model of a purely capitalist society created by a charismatic capitalist, that was my grandfather, who designed basically all the social structures to enable and supercharge capitalism, and that involved a lot of social controls over the labor force that we begin to even see today in terms of restrictions on immigration, use of political force, if not violence, to suppress dissent. The sort of notion that white Protestant men are the best stewards of a society like this, that was the case at Seabrook. And then the corruption really that sets in as the limits of capitalism are overtopped and the rules are broken and lies are told, and the family, in my case, begins to lie to each other, and eventually the corruption sets into the very structure of the family itself, and the family is destroyed by it. That's the story of capitalism. That's the story of capitalism in the Spinach King. I don't know if that's the story of capitalism at large yet. We don't know the answer, but there are certain parallels with Trump and the second Trump administration that are hard to deny, I think, when you compare the story of the Spinach King to what's happening in the U.S. in some ways today.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about Trump because I'm sure you're sick of talking about him as well. Your grandfather has been C.F. Seabrook, the patriarch of the family, has been described as the Henry Ford of agriculture. Of course, before Trump, there was Ford. Tell me briefly, John. It's a wonderful book, a fascinating book, beautifully written. But very briefly, tell me the history of C.F. Seabrook, this king of American spinach.
Yeah. So C.F. Seabrook was the son of a British immigrant who was born on a farm in southern New Jersey in 1881. And his father was a successful but small grower of vegetables, sort of high-end produce for city markets, what we think of today as maybe farm to table kind of operation. And he had about 60 acres and did pretty well. But his son was extremely ambitious. He was inspired by Henry Ford, who was 20 years older, by the mass production techniques that Henry Ford had put into place in Detroit. And he kind of had this somewhat crazy notion that he was going to apply those principles to the farm. And he was going to create a sort of industrial version of his father's vegetable farm and produce vegetables on a massive scale, and then create a processing factory on site so that the whole operation would be integrated from, seed to final product. And he struggled with that for a number of years. But when the technology of frozen food came in the 30s, he didn't invent it, but it was invented by Clarence Birdseye. But he knew Birdseye, and Birdseye had struggled with freezing vegetables. He had sort of perfected the process with fish and poultry, but he hadn't figured out how to freeze vegetables. And so my grandfather did a number of experiments down on the farm, kind of came up with a process, and eventually became the main packer for Birdseye's vegetable products. And he grew them and packed them right there. And then after the Second World War, which made the company much larger because frozen food became an important wartime product, the Seabrook family, which was at that point my grandfather and his three sons, the youngest of which was my father, started their own brand, which was called Seabrook Farms. And then in the 50s, there's my father as a young man. And then in the 50s, it became very big and successful. At their largest, they packed a third of all the frozen vegetables in the country. They introduced a technique of sort of boiling in the bag, which became kind of an industry standard. They did a number of other sort of innovative things. And they were all set to be a great industrial farm. I mean, they were, but unfortunately, there was a succession battle between the father and the sons. And that's
so
another story.
Just listening to that, if I didn't know about the Spinach King, John, I would have thought this is a kind of Randian tale of capitalist innovation, of scaling, of industrialized farming, like the equivalent, the agricultural equivalent of Ford or so many of the other industrial breakthroughs of the first part of the 20th century, leaving aside the scandals and the corruption and the dishonesty and all the other stuff we'll get into. I'm guessing in some ways your grandfather was a remarkably innovative and successful fellow, wasn't he?
Oh yeah, he certainly he wasn't educated, but he had a instinct for kind of practical solutions to farming problems using engineering, using technology that was already available but hadn't really been applied to the farm. He lived at a time, I mean, he was fortunate in that he came of age as the country was mechanizing. So really the first 20 years of the 20th century were his sort of early manhood. And that was the time when the country really dramatically shifted from agricultural economy to an industrial economy. And by 1920, he had gotten rid of all the horses on the farm and replaced them all with machines. So, he was very good at taking advantage of the technologies at hand. He was also a very good promoter of the business. Mechanized agriculture was a big hot new trend in those days in the early 20th century. And he raised a lot of money promoting his farm as a mechanized farm. But the rub was, and the flaw in the plan, and one reason why it didn't really succeed was because, yes, he had mechanized certain aspects of the business of farming, but there were other aspects that he never mechanized that required hands, whether it was in the harvest or whether it was in the cultivation or in the replanting. There were certain key moments in the production process that machines couldn't do. And so even as his business grew and continued to mechanize, his need for labor also continued to grow. And this was at a time when farm labor was becoming increasingly hard to find, certainly from American citizens who, certainly after the war, didn't want to come back and do what they've been doing before on the farm. And so he had to look further and further afield. He got involved in certain situations with worker groups that ended up creating, social problems. We can go into some of those. The Japanese and Americans who came from internment camps.
Italians strike breaking.
Yeah.
John, we did a show a few months ago with Edward Ball. I'm sure you're familiar with his book, Slaves in the Family, which is a confessional about his slave-owning family at one point, I think in the late 18th century, the largest, wealthiest slave-owning family in America. I don't want to accuse your grandfather or Seabrook of being slave owners, but is that the great moral blot on the company, their treatment of workers?
Well, I think the thing is they had this huge vegetable plantation, right? And they're looking for a model for how such an organization could be profitable. And unfortunately, there is a model for that, and it's slavery. And so, of course, my grandfather didn't enslave anyone, but he paid people as little as he could because the margins really weren't that big, and he wasn't going to do what he wanted to do if he didn't. And that is what really led to these huge labor issues in the 30s. But ultimately, it wasn't the labor issues that brought them down. It was the different attitude of his sons toward the labor issues. Like, he was my grandfather, absolutely opposed to unions, very anti-union. And, as I said, used violence to suppress the attempts to unionize. My father, who was 40 years younger than his father, and who, unlike his father, had been educated and had gone to Princeton. So he'd been educated with the American elite. He had acquired a whole different, I'm not saying he certainly wasn't a liberal, but progressive values had sort of found their way into his thinking through his education. And so he was in favor of unionizing and in favor of integrating the plant. I think it was the conflicts between the two generations. And on top of that, you had all these class conflicts because my grandfather hated bankers. I mean, he needed them, but he hated them. He hated them giving control, and he resented the investment bankers because they looked down on him as, sort of a rude mechanical, whereas my father was sort of one of them. And I think my grandfather began to think that he was more on the bankers' side than on his side, and that just kind of ate away at their relationship and at the business. So ultimately, I don't think it was necessarily the social issues themselves. It was the way the generations perceived those issues and their sort of dysfunctional relationship because of those issues.
John, your friend John Cassidy, I'm sure, be familiar with this phrase. He's from Yorkshire. Clogs to clogs in 3 generations. In other words, the narrative you're talking about of a brutal Darwinian father, successful capitalist, and then someone more liberal like your father is fairly normal. Is that the narrative of the family, that perhaps your father in particular, as an example of an educated man at Princeton, didn't quite understand capitalism? It's interesting in terms of comparing your grandfather with Henry Ford. Henry Ford was a very unpleasant man on many levels, but he paid his workers well because he understood that he needed to do that in order for people to buy cars. Did your grandfather not think like Ford in that context?
I think he thought like Ford in that he provided them with housing, although he charged them rent for the housing. He provided people with security. He provided services. There was childcare. There was an infirmary. There were sort of social activities that were organized for people. He felt, and there was a school that the children of workers that he built that the children of workers could go to. So it wasn't so much that he offered them money. Certainly, he tried to pay as little as possible. I don't know whether ultimately it was because he was just cheap or whether it was the business couldn't have tolerated higher wages. I never really could figure that out, but he certainly tried to keep workers around by, making their lives more pleasant than they might have been in another place where they were working. But you're absolutely right. Henry Ford had the $5 a day, of course, famous 1914, I think it was, gift to workers that and also those workers were unionized early on, and the unions were interested in unionizing industrial workers, whereas farm workers, because a lot of them were migrant, they moved from place to place. They didn't have much money to begin with. The unions were never really all that interested in farm work. And a lot of farm workers were excluded from some of the labor laws that came in during the New Deal. So I think it's hard to compare apples and oranges when you're talking about a sort of fundamentally kind of agricultural business that's seasonal, that has slack seasons and busy seasons. And one of the other huge issues with the labor was that he didn't want to keep a lot of the labor around in the winter months when there wasn't any work to do, so he would lay them off. And
so they were seasonal workers in many ways. I mean, is your book helpful in terms of the contemporary debates about immigrant workers? I mean, agriculture, I'm in California, where much of the food grown here is cultivated by immigrants, or sometimes perhaps, I don't know what words we use, non-legal immigrants. What does The Spinach King tell us about the history of agricultural labor in America over the last 100 years? Has anything much changed?
Well, Americans don't want to do the work. I mean, it's hard work, and it's outdoors. It's in the weather. It's in the elements, and it's not as reliable in that it's maybe not all year long. So it was never. I mean, once factory jobs became available in the cities, I think a lot of people said, they left the farm. They moved to the cities, and that was another part of Seabrook's outreach to workers. Is it was in reaction to that big urbanization. Seabrook was saying, "Hey, you're living in a tenement in this city. You're breathing unpolluted air. Come down to the farm where the air is healthy and there's plenty of space." And so they kind of represented the employment as more healthful, I guess, if not more remunerative. But yeah, I mean, it's a question of looking beyond the borders of the United States for workers. And Seabrook was innovative in that the first of those workers came during the Second World War as part of the Lend-Lease program with Britain. The British colonies in the West Indies, Barbados, Jamaica, they sent workers to farms on the East Coast during the war to supplement the labor that was away at the war, and that was really some of the very first times that what is now very common is importing foreign workers for farm work on the East Coast and having them stay, temporarily and then leaving. That was really the first time that happened. And then in California, you had the Bracero program, which was sort of parallel to that. But this was a huge change in where the workers came from that really happened during the Second World War. And then after the war, it was very hard to find Americans to do farm work. And that's kind of where we are today still. And then you try to rely on technology to do the work instead of humans. But we still haven't gotten there with a lot of crops. You still need people to pick them or cultivate them.
How much of this narrative, John, is on behalf of your father? I think you note in the book that he probably should have written the book. He didn't. You have. You're a professional writer. He didn't do so well out of Seabrook Farms. Is there some anger in this book for you, not just towards American capitalism, but towards your grandfather?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was motivated by revenge. It turns out the revenge.
It's funny, we did a show yesterday on revenge, and there's some social psychiatrist at Yale who wants to get rid of it, who says it's the curse of the country. But of course, it's all too human, isn't it, John?
It's a fantastic motivator for writing. Like, I have to say, like, the idea that, my father was always very protective of his father. He never told me, clearly some terrible things had happened. He had ended up being disowned by his father, but he never told me what happened. But after he died, he left me these documents and papers that showed just how abusive, emotionally, psychologically abusive his father was to him. And after I saw those things, I was really pissed off. I was very motivated to revenge my father. And I also had this sort of distinct feeling that I am the only person on earth left that knows this stuff about my grandfather. And, I'm the only human standing between him and, basically a nice posterity for the rest of time. And I wasn't going to let him go gently into that good night.
Did you know how well did you know your grandfather?
I didn't know him. I didn't know him. He died. He lived. We overlapped by 5 years, but I only met him once, and he was very far gone, dementia.
And did you have a grandmother? Was he married?
Yeah, I had a grandmother who I did know and who was very sweet, but who had absolutely no control over him, and who he also seemed to have treated very badly, and she just kind of put up with it.
I guess I don't want to keep on bringing up Trump. There's certainly a Trumpian element. You seem to suggest that your grandfather had a narcissistic personality. He was in love with himself. Is that fair?
I think he must have had, there's various explanations for why he behaved toward the end of his life the way he did. One is that he was just kind of born that way, he was a narcissist from the beginning, and there's certainly evidence of that when in some of the things that his parents left behind. But my father, who, as I said, was always sort of a little bit trying to forgive his father, he harped on this medical event that had occurred early in the Second World War, when my grandfather had a stroke, and certainly for a couple of years was unable to function with his previous energy, and started taking pills, phenobarbital, which was a sort of a popular drug in those days, and it has different effects on you, but taken with alcohol and taken in excess can make you paranoid and crazy. And there's a lot of evidence that that had a big effect.
Was
on
he
his
just
behavior.
psychologically brutal? Was he physically? Did he beat his sons?
No, he was physically, he wasn't a physical authority. He wasn't a man. He was small, very slight. My father was 8 inches taller than he was.
Hmm.
There he is in the front. He was a small man. He was a he was a, I would say, passive aggressive. He didn't
Yeah, he has that man in the gray suit look, sort of
yeah,
a technocratic
he
little.
operated coming sort of slyly, sort of side door kind of stuff. Not
But there was a slyness about
confrontation.
him too. Didn't he cheat his own father in terms of setting the business up?
Yeah, that's another sort of reason for his craziness given in the story, is that he himself had cheated his father by buying. He made friends in New York in 1912 with with these Brooklyn capitalists who agreed to back this kind of industrialization of the farm. And then he didn't tell his father that he had, had these capitalists backing him, and he bought his father's share of the land for far less than it was worth. And then, when his father ran out of money, he never really helped him out. But in later life, he claimed to be tormented by guilt because of the way he treated his father, and that was why he treated his sons badly, because he felt that his sons were going to do the same thing to him.
The more I hear about it, John, there's a Trumpian quality to your grandfather, but not Donald Trump. Fred Trump, of course. Fred Trump bullied his oldest son. He died. The alcoholic pilot. Donald Trump's bizarre personality is a reflection of that. What were the other two brothers like? Did he favoritize them because of their politics, because of their age?
I'll answer that in a second. But it's interesting that Fred Trump was actually called the Henry Ford of housing.
Yeah.
There was, I guess, a popular formulation in those days. But
just now, like, everyone's called either the Elon Musk or the Jeff Bezos of this or that.
Right, exactly. No, so each of the brothers, there was three brothers, and each of them was trained in a different field of engineering. The oldest one was named Belford, and he was a mechanical engineer, and he and his father were the ones that really got the frozen food operation up and running. The middle brother, whose name was Courtney, was a salesman who eventually developed the brand and became the marketing guy, and was very clever and innovative in the way the company was marketed. The company used the family itself as the sort of brand image and story, which also caused a lot of problems, I think, because eventually the real family couldn't really live up to what the branded family's reputation was built up to be. But Courtney was that guy. And then my father, who eventually became the CEO of the company and took over, was the sort of the finance guy, like his father. He sort of dealt with the bankers and knew the inside and outside of the company's finances, and was very clever.
Were relations between the brothers? Did they all, I wouldn't say loathe, but were they fearful of their father? Did they unite, or did he divide the brothers?
He tried to divide them, as he tried, his divide and conquer was certainly his method of dealing both with his sons and with his workers. But the sons actually stayed bonded together. I mean, I think there were tensions because my father was the youngest and he eventually became the head of the company. But actually, they never really broke their friendship, their relationship, and they stayed connected. And even after the company ended, they were friendly and saw each other, and their children were also friendly. So yeah, that was actually a nice thing. The sibling that didn't fare well was their sister. They had a sister, and the sister sided with the father when eventually relations got to the point where the brothers tried to have the father committed.
Oh my
Uh,
God.
and the sister sided with the father, and eventually that made it impossible to have the father committed, and therefore the brothers turned on the sister, and so the whole thing really just became a mess. And then when he died, my grandfather, he left a lot of money to his daughter and none to his sons, and they then sued the estate to try to have the will thrown out. So there was a lot of bad blood between them that came out of it. But the brothers actually weathered it pretty well.
How do you expect, the book is out tomorrow, The Spinach King, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. How do you expect the family to respond? Are there still relatives of the sisters who may sue you or deny the truth of your story?
Well, I have family members that are still in the business because so Belford, the oldest, his family so Seabrook Farms ended in 1975, but in the 80s, the children of Belford started another frozen food vegetable company about a mile from the old one, which is called Seabrook Brothers and Sons, and now their children run it, and they actually pack the label. Seabrook Farms they own the label, and they still pack that product. They probably are not going to love the book. Politically, they're Trump supporters, and they. My grandfather is seen as a great man by them, and actually by many of the workers that came through Seabrook Farms. He successfully like Trump, even though he was often acting not in their interests. He gave them a feeling of belonging to something that was special. It was Seabrook. It was this thing that this man who they could see every day had created. And even though he exploited them, and even though their lives would have been maybe better in another place, there was a feeling of being at the center of things and belonging to a very important organization that kept people not only around, but even long after he was gone, continued to sort of celebrate him as a kind man, as a warm man, as a giving man, as a man of the people. And I don't think he was really any of those things.
Well, there's certainly that Trumpian quality of bringing people, even if it's in a dishonest way, a degree of pride. Right. One of the other things, John, you talk about in the book is the glamour of the Seabrooks, the uppity nature in social and cultural terms. Some people might say, well, if you make a lot of money, why not? Americans have always want to be aristocrats. You just need to read Gatsby for that. What's wrong with wanting to be an aristocrat, and why is that an important piece of your narrative?
I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it, but my family rushed very quickly into they kind of slid up the social ladder in a generation and a half, in where it would probably take at least 3 for most families to really sort of do that in any kind of natural way. So there was a lot of hurry, and there was a lot of attempts to appear to be the thing that they wanted people to think they were, but maybe they weren't feeling completely confident as a member of this particular elite. And so I think it just like certain things became like wine, food, and then eventually horses became these kind of totemic aspects of aristocratic life that my family embraced almost with 2 fists, so avidly that it began to, I think, feel like, what are our values here? Are we just sort of involved in some kind of business of representing ourselves to be like the rich man on the monopoly board. There was sort of, my grandfather got a Rolls Royce as soon as he could and drove around the fields in his Rolls Royce. It was a very in your face kind of, aristocratic behavior. It wasn't really what I would think of as aristocratic behavior. I mean, maybe was it Gatsby? Even Gatsby was a lot more charming, really.
Although Americans have always been, because of the supposedly democratic, egalitarian foundations of the country, Americans have always been very ambivalent and uncomfortable with the idea of aristocracy, haven't they, John?
Yeah, but I think for my grandfather really felt like he was an aristocrat, and he looking like many Americans who become successful very quickly in trying to figure out who he was and a model for what his life should be. He looked to England and to the British aristocrats who lived, on immense inherited estates and had family dynasties that lasted 500 years. That's who he thought we were. And that's how he conceived of his land. I mean, because he did have this immense amount of, he had 20,000 acres of land in New Jersey. He was like a duke in that regard. And then my father spent all of his money sort of pushing beyond that and driving a coach and 4 horses. Why? No American, or few American aristocrats would even go that far. Maybe the Gilded Age they did, but he kind of went farther than most.
Is there finally, John, a kind of a degree of nostalgia here? The book is called The Spinach King, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. Clearly, the dynasty wasn't morally very uplifting, but spinach isn't so bad, is it? I mean, perhaps Americans should eat more spinach. I'm curious, the Popeye myth. Did your family have any association? How did spinach get marketed, and was it quite a good thing? I mean, frozen spinach is better than no spinach at all.
That's actually, I think, better than fresh spinach. It's frozen cream spinach. No, I mean, I think one of the reasons why the company was capitalized in the first place was that it was providing fresh vegetables for people that might not have access to them. And, it was also at a time when the role of vitamins and the recognition of vitamins and the role they played in health was becoming known in early 20th century. And vitamins were, I mean, before the 20th century, a vegetable was basically a potato. I mean, that was what you ate. If you're eating your vegetables, you ate potatoes. So like green vegetables were sort of a aristocratic thing, but for ordinary people who have access to green vegetables, really wasn't all that common. And so, yeah, he kind of mass produced what was essentially a sort of elite commodity and made it available to everybody. And I don't think you can fault that. That was a good thing.
And finally, in our age of Alice Waters, I saw her speak last week in San Francisco, Chez Panisse and the ideal of local markets. What does the Spinach King, what should and can it tell us about the future of American agriculture, perhaps more local producers, local markets? Is there any moral in that story about making American agriculture more accessible, fairer, more profitable and prosperous?
I think if you think about like Alice Waters, as the farmers that still grow products for Chez Panisse. I visited some of those farms. Those are relatively small operations that they get to a certain point. I think the rule for these farms is 1 acre, 1 worker, and it's always been that way. It hasn't changed. And you can have farms that get up to a certain point and are sustainable. But I think once you get certainly vegetable farms beyond a certain point, I think the lesson of Seabrook Farms is it just becomes very, very difficult to sustain it, really because of the labor and the need for just this immense amount, of labor that AI, has yet to come up with machines or methodologies for harvesting. I think agriculture is this just kind of stubborn product that doesn't want to kind of always conform to modernity and progress. And my grandfather tried to make it skip to that kind of modern beat, and it half did, but it ultimately kind of got too big and just sort of collapsed of its own weight. And I'm not sure whether anyone would ever try to do anything like that again. The lesson is it just doesn't really work.
Although it does, I mean, you seem to be saying that agriculture doesn't scale. We live in an age of industrialized agriculture, of huge farms,
but grain farms, really, mainly grain farms, that can be harvested with machines. Or a product that can be picked by machines. Lettuce, spinach. I think it's harder to have like giant industrial farms with those crops.
Well, interesting conversation with John Seabrook. John, I was going to call you the Henry Ford of journalism, but I think that you would take that as an insult. But you have a new book out, The Spinach King, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. You've written a number of bestsellers before. I'm sure this one's going to do extremely well. Congratulations. Go and eat your spinach, John.
Thank you, Andrew. You should eat yours too.
I will do. I'm going to go and buy some frozen spinach now. Thank you so much.
Okay. Ciao. Cheers.